Russia has officially suspended its participation in the Cold War-era nuclear treaty with the United States. The Kremlin said President Vladimir Putin signed a decree to suspend the INF treaty. It added that the president ordered the treaty to be suspended until Washington stops violating the agreement. According to the Kremlin, Putin has told the Russian Foreign Ministry to inform signatories to the accord of Russia's move. The treaty was signed in 1987 between the U.S. and a former Soviet Union. Under the deal, the U.S. and the Soviets would scrap all their intermediate range and short-range missiles, but last year Washington said it would withdraw from the accord, accusing Russia of violating the agreement. Moscow strongly denies these allegations. To discuss that more, we're joined by Mr. Vladimir Goldstein, lecturer at Brown University, who is joining us live from Rhode Island, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us live from Bristol. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for discussing this very important issue. Now, let's start with Mr. Vladimir Goldstein. Since when did the INF become such a bone of contention? Was this also an issue during Obama? Well, we did hear Mr. Donald Trump accuse Obama of turning a blind eye on the Russians violating the INF. How true is that?
Well, I think there are two main kind of reasons behind it. One is that increased hostility between the United States and Russia, increased suspicion and paranoia, increased level of accusations. Americans now more and more view Russia as a threat. It's that thanks basically to the democratic-driven propaganda against Russia, which took place already under Obama and went full-blown after this election. So there is like a suspicion between the countries. But I think there is also another very important player in this thing is China. When the treaty was signed before, China was not such a big threat to the United States, maybe to Russia, and they had to deal with it, but not to the United States. Now I think China is sort of definitely flexing its muscle. It's clear to everyone that it's going to overshadow the United States economically. So the United States need to have all the arsenal of weapons at its disposal. And this treaty with Russia was some kind of an obstacle. So they will be looking for any kind of pretext, blaming Russia for this or for that, for the fact that Russia has some kind of a particular weapon which it can fly further. Russia, of course, knows what the United States is developing their weapons, but the most important thing which upsets Russia is that the United States wants to place more and more middle-range weapons in Europe. So the United States also want to militarize the Europe. So Russia is not happy. But we have to see it within this wider context of increased China's influence and increased hostility and suspicion between the two countries.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to Mr. Tony Gosling. Now, how much of this, Mr. Gosling, do you believe does Mr. Trump own himself? How much of this is being put into his mouth by people surrounding him? The INF did not seem to be an issue, at least when Donald Trump was campaigning. So since when did this become an issue?
Well, that's a really good point, because Trump is increasingly coming under threat from the military-industrial complex, threat of impeachment, all this sort of thing. So this is effectively what the mafia would call blackmail. So the idea here is to get all sorts of legal questions against Donald Trump, and then say to him there, well, if you want to survive as president, you're going to sign on the dotted line. And that dotted line could lead to nuclear war, potentially. And I agree with what Vladimir is saying there, but I think it's also, we in Europe here, I'm speaking to you from England, the United Kingdom, we're getting fed up. We've had 50 years now of the United States threatening Russia, but trying to use Europe as its battleground. Let me just remind people that if the Americans wanted to threaten Russia, they can go to Alaska and go the other way. the Europeans are really not interested in fighting United States wars with them. We had a very, very bloody war with Russia, between Germany and Russia, in the 1940s. And this has been happening in Europe for many, many years. The Europeans want to get along with the Russians. They want to trade with the Russians. They love the Russians. They respect the Russians. And the Americans, it seems, all they want to do is to get a war started. It's very easy for them to say this because they are something like 4,000 or 5,000 miles away from the actual battlefield. But look, the devil is in the detail with this Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Back on the 24th of January, the Russians pointed out that the missile that the Americans are getting annoyed about, the 9M729 missile, they displayed it in Moscow, and they said, if you want to come and test it, come and test it, come and have a look at it. This thing can only go 480 kilometers before it conks out and it hits the ground. So it doesn't violate the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty at all, and we can prove it. But the Americans are not interested in the details. They've already decided that they want to ramp up tensions with the Russians. And the British have also been ramping up tensions with the Skripal case, the Novichok poisoning in Salisbury, which I, as a former BBC Salisbury reporter, would tell you has got very little real hard evidence behind it. And the most likely source of that chemical Novichok was Porton Down, which is just 5 minutes drive away from Salisbury, the British chemical and biological weapons site. So there is an attempt to ramp up tension, which I think this is just another part of it. But the thing is, it could mean potentially a nuclear war. The Americans have been pulling out of treaties like they're going out of fashion. We've had them pulling out of the JCPOA, the Iran Nuclear Treaty, the OECD, the Paris Climate Accords. The Americans are behaving now like a rogue state that doesn't believe in any kind of international law or international order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gosline, for that very spirited explanation. Now let's turn back to Mr. Goldstein. What do you think? Well, I'm very sorry, Mr. Vladimir Goldstein. I have the wrong name here. I'm Vladimir. Back to you. Our friend here, our guest, pointed out a very important issue: a nuclear war, a nuclear arms race. Do you think the Russians saying that they are not going to be bound to the INF anymore will signal another nuclear arms race?
Well, I agree, absolutely agree with your guest said, and we have to also, a third kind of component of this escalated tension is total unpredictability of President Trump. That, it wasn't his agenda, escalation of hostility. In fact, he was running on the opposite agenda. But now we see how he's been bullied by all sorts of Pentagon, CIA, Democrats into sort of acting more and more aggressively. And Russians absolutely justifiably feel that Putin and Russian Ministry of Defense, they have one primary responsibility: to protect its own population, its own country. God knows what the United States is going to do. We do know that they pushed NATO to the very borders of Russia. They now deploy these very dangerous weapons in Romania, in Bulgaria. So, and Putin, at a certain moment, he has this very good image, says we're tired of knocking at the closed door. They were trying to negotiate, they're trying to sort of de-escalate, but the United States keeps on pushing, keeps on accusing, and eventually, Russia sort of took their kind of, pushed their doctrine in sort of a particular direction that we want sort of, protect ourselves, and protection means we're going to target not just only Europeans who are going to host this weapon, but we're also going to target the command centers from there. The potential attack on us will occur. So Russians are sort of trying to sort of assure that there is kind of enough weapons of just mutual destruction. So it will wake up America not to escalate. But at least they want to make sure that they have enough force to answer back if they attack. Because United States have to be aware they cannot win nuclear war. For some reason, there is still some nuts in Pentagon who write books, who study and say that local nuclear war can be won. It won't be. And sort of Putin is absolutely correct by sending this message and said we are taking responsibility in protecting our borders and making sure that there is enough deterrence for the war not to happen.
Thank you very much. Now, Tony, I saw that you were smiling when Vladimir was talking. So your final thoughts on that, how much do you agree with Vladimir?
Well, we're in an increasingly dangerous situation. Potential war coming in the Middle East. The British banning Hezbollah's political wing means really that the British Home Office, the British government, are very weak. They're caving into Israeli pressure. And that means that there's a potential of a possible war between Israel and Iran. Now, that could bring in Saudi Arabia. It could bring in the United States. It could mean fighting with Russia. And this is the scenario I think we should be actually making sure doesn't happen. That sort of thing could turn nuclear. Obviously, the Chinese, if the United States and Russia started fighting in Syria, the Chinese could easily be dragged in. But I must point out, the Americans are the real violators of the international treaties. They've now put into production the United States mini nuke. For any people out there who would like to write it down, it's called a W76-2, and this is now in production in the United States. It violates all treaties. It's a sort of small nuclear device which could easily be used in a conventional war, which could help trip a conventional war into a nuclear war. And I think this is the one thing that we're not hearing in any of the Western media. Well, there's quite a lot we don't hear in the Western media, like, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, the opposition leader in Britain today, saying that he wants to ban all arms sales from Britain to Israel. That hasn't been anywhere in the Western press, but that's what our opposition leader said today. That these sorts of violations by the United States are simply not being reported. They're censored in the West. Which is why it's nice to have the opportunity to tell your viewers now that that's the case. The Americans are violating the treaty, not the Russians, and so we've got the pot calling the kettle black. I think we're in a very dangerous situation. We just need to make sure that this Middle East war scenario it is never allowed to get started in the first place.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist joining us live from Bristol. Thank you very much for your elaboration, sir. And also you, Mr. Vladimir Goldstein, lecturer at Brown University, joining us live from Rhode Island. And thank you to all our viewers for joining us on this edition of the News Review.